Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to present our project called MassROUTES, Developing a GIS-Based Screening Tool for Equity-Centered Clean Transportation Investments in Massachusetts. My name is Rachel Bowers. I'm an MA student at UEP.
I am Nilakshi Chatterjee, doing my MS at UEP.
I'm Ali Heipel, also doing an MS at UEP.
I'm Ellie Lockhead. I'm an MS in Economics in UEP.
My name is Lucy Xu. I'm a student in Sustainability Studies.
The partner organization for this project is the Union of Concerned Scientists, whose mission is to use rigorous, independent science to solve our planet's most pressing problems. We worked closely with the UCS Clean Transportation Program, which focuses on transportation and climate-related issues and advocates for clean, modern, sustainable, and equitable transportation systems. Next. For an overview of our presentation, we will first present background and goals for the project. We will then outline the methodology for our screening tool, and we'll discuss the results and output, including a demonstration of the MassROUTES web app. We will then provide policy recommendations that accompany the tool. Finally, we will discuss limitations and next steps. Next slide.
So I'm going to talk about the background context for our project, but first, just a quick note. We'll be using the term transportation pretty broadly today, meaning mass public transit like buses and the T, private transport like individual cars, and active transportation like bike-ped. So we are not including ride sharing or interstate or international transportation like air travel. Next slide. I'll start by talking about some of the overarching issues which framed our project and which will help situate the challenges that MassROUTES is meant to address. First, the transportation sector is a significant contributor to both greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to pollutants with more localized health impacts, like PM 2.5, which is fine particulate matter. And this pollution disproportionately impacts low-income communities and people of color. A study by the Union of Concerned Scientists found that in Massachusetts, these communities are exposed to 30% more PM 2.5 than white residents are. Systemic inequities exacerbate these issues and result in cumulative impacts, which we'll talk more about later on. For this reason, policies to improve climate and transportation challenges absolutely must center equity as well. This reality, that socioeconomically vulnerable populations are often overburdened by transportation-related air pollution, while being underserved by the transportation system itself, is the central focus of this project. Next slide. To begin addressing the problem of transportation pollution, Massachusetts is engaged in a regional collaboration called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. TCI is a partnership of states in the Mid-Atlantic and New England region and is modeled after RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. RGGI is a cap-and-trade program for the power sector, and TCI is a similar program for transportation. TCI is designed as a cap-and-invest model in which the funds from the sale of emissions allowances are invested back into clean transportation improvements. This implementation and investment is up to the states to direct themselves, and that's where we come in. Next slide. There is a coalition of advocates working across the TCI states to ensure that equity is built into the final policy. One goal, although not yet finalized, is to ensure that a minimum percentage of investment is dedicated directly to priority populations. These are socioeconomically vulnerable communities which are overburdened by transportation-related air pollution and are underserved in terms of the current transportation system. Massachusetts is working on this too and has identified equity as a driving goal for their own policy implementation, as you can see in this quote from the state's webpage. The Union of Concerned Scientists is a partner organization to implement TCI in the state, and so our goal for them was to build a screening tool that would identify priority populations in which to invest the TCI funds. Next slide.
So this background and context bring us to our research question: where and how should Massachusetts prioritize clean transportation investments to reduce air pollution emissions while addressing statewide inequities, with a focus on those who are overburdened by transportation pollution and underserved by our existing transportation system. To answer this question, our project has two main deliverables. The first is a screening tool called MassROUTES, which stands for Massachusetts Screening System for Recognizing Those Who Are Overburdened and Underserved by Transportation, Environment, and Socioeconomic Status. The second deliverable is policy recommendations for how to refine and use MassROUTES in practice.
I will be talking more about our screening tool methodology. Next. Based on our research question, we wanted to create a tool that would account for the fact that exposures to environmental threats are magnified by things like socioeconomic status or access to transit or health risks. Thus, we wanted to look at the cumulative impacts of multiple stressors. Risk or impact is explained by both exposure to threat and vulnerability. Next. CalEPA developed the CalEnviro screen to map and address a range of relative burdens due to environmental and socioeconomic vulnerabilities and to help decision makers prioritize resource allocation to California's disadvantaged populations and areas. CalEnviro screen uses a multiplicative model to calculate cumulative impact of the pollution and socioeconomic indicators at a census tract level. It includes 12 pollution indicators grouped as pollution burdens and 8 demographic indicators grouped as population characteristics. The tool uses a percentile scoring system which allows comparisons between geographic areas. It also has a web interface that can be used to access the tool's results. Next. Our screening tool is based on the CalEnviro screen model. Some of its key features are, we have used census tracts as our spatial unit of analysis, which is relatively fine scale. The indicators that we have used for the tool are Massachusetts-centric and are largely based on literature and the EJ screen and CalEnviro screen models. We have used a percentile scoring system, which not only facilitates comparisons, but can also be considered to be a way of putting data with different units on the same scale. The methods that we have used can be scaled and adapted by any geographic area and at any geographic scope, provided that there is data availability. We have also created a web interface to visualize our results so that our results are accessible and interpretable for further analysis. Next. We have 3 main categories that describe our indicators. Environment, indicating exposure to environmental threats. Population and transportation, indicating vulnerability. Every category includes 2 subcategories and every subcategory has a set of indicators. Under environment, we have burdens and vehicular air pollution. The first subcategory under population is socioeconomic distress and the second one is health. The subcategories under transportation are private and public transportation. We started off with 39 indicators and ended up modeling 33 of them. Environment has 9, population has 19, transportation has 5 indicators. The data that we have used are all publicly available and are at a census tract level. Next. The first step of our methodology was to map the indicator data. Some of the transportation and environment indicators had very different and unique mapping methods. The next step was to compute scores for every subcategory using the indicators. We used the principal component analysis for this, as PCA helps to reduce multivariate dimensions. The PCA output for every subcategory was assigned percentile scores, and we call these percentile scores our subcategory scores. Areas with high exposures to threat and high vulnerability are assigned higher percentiles. The subcategory scores are then averaged to compute category scores. The category scores are scaled on a range of 0 to 10 using the respective maximum scores within the state. The scale scores were finally combined to calculate the final screening tool score. Next. This is the analytical framework of our screening tool. The cumulative impact model discussed earlier has been modified based on our set of indicators to create this framework. The MassROUTES cumulative impact score has been calculated as the product of the environment score and the average of the population and transportation scores. Based on our methodology, the cumulative impact score can range between 0 to 100. The final scores were also ranked using percentiles. Higher scores indicate priority population. Next.
Using the above analytical framework, we mapped our category level scores for our 3 main categories and then compiled a final score map. This is our environment category. This is showing relative exposure to environmental threats, red showing tracts with the highest exposure relative to other Massachusetts tracts, calculated from the indicator list above. And the zoomed in area is Boston, which helps show that most tracts with the highest environmental threat are in the Boston metro area for a few reasons. Urban heat island effect, intersection of major highways, so more pollution, more limited open space. But there are tracts in other places like Springfield and Worcester, New Bedford that are showing up in this category as well. And there are some more rural tracts also that are yellow or orange, and that's mainly because of the presence of a major east-west or north-south highway passing through, which increases the environment score. This is our population category. This map is showing tracts with high socioeconomic and health vulnerabilities relative to other tracts, with those vulnerabilities represented again by the above indicator list. And once again, tracts in the Boston metro area, as well as some of the other larger Massachusetts cities, are showing up as highest vulnerability. And population density is contributing to this, but also the fact that these places have more tracts with high poverty, larger non-white and non-English speaking populations, and more people with lower educational attainment, as well as the other indicators. But there are a few smaller communities that are also showing up red here. Examples are Pittsfield in Western Massachusetts and Fitchburg. These are old industry towns that now have higher unemployment and uninsurance rates, which pushes the population score up. This is our transportation category. This is showing in red higher transportation vulnerability, meaning less access to both public and private transportation. And at first, this map just seems like the reverse of the other two, since cities have public transit and more rural areas don't. But the Boston zoom in and warmer colors in places like Fall River and Worcester show that there are some tracts scoring high in all three categories, including transportation. And so in these more urban areas, some of these tracts have less access to transit than others, but mostly what's driving this score is low private vehicle ownership in these tracts. So our cumulative impact score comes from multiplying environmental threats by population and transportation vulnerabilities to get our final score. And Nalakshi has built a really great web map that makes these final results very searchable and usable. So we will show you our web map now. So just taking a first look at the overview of our cumulative impact score, we can see some of the areas that are showing up as highest priority, mostly census tracts in the Boston metro area, in Fall River, Worcester, Springfield, some of these other places. You can search for any of these places up in the search bar here, by address, by city, by any level. There's also this query tool. So if you're interested in a range of scores, either the final score or any of the category scores, you can search them here. So if you wanted to look at some of our highest scoring census tracts overall, you can search for those. It'll pull up a list of tracts. It gives you the option to export these as CSV. You can also click on one of these tracts and it'll take you to the tract. And once you're there, if you click on it, it'll pull up the full list of indicator values, as well as our final category scores, the final score, and the final percentile. And if you're interested in looking at what is in this tract, the slider tool can help you see the score layer or not. Zooming back out, a few other helpful tools is the option to print the map. If you have additional data that you want to add as a layer, there's an add data option. You can also pull up the attribute table. So this format makes the tool really interpretable, really usable for advocates, for policymakers who are wanting to use this information. This is the primary deliverable of our project, along with the policy recommendations that accompany it, which Rachel will discuss next.
So before the MassROUTES screening tool is applied in practice, there are important considerations that should be taken into account. We have delineated 2 equity-focused policy recommendations that accompany the tool. Next. So for our first recommendation, while MassROUTES was designed to be adaptable, scalable, and equity-centered, we recognize that as a data-driven tool, it is really only as meaningful as the data that it's based on. So our first recommendation accounts for this limitation and suggests 2 methods for strengthening the tool. First, we looked at research in Washington State and California that concluded that it's important to meaningfully engage communities in the construction of cumulative impact screening tools like MassROUTES. Engaging communities can embed localized, lived experiences that quantitative data alone just doesn't pick up on. Drawing from this research, we suggest that Massachusetts engage priority populations in the form of a working group that weighs in on what factors to include in the tool, how to weigh them, and how to apply the results of the tool in practice. This will result in a more representative tool built in collaboration between policymakers and priority communities. Our second suggestion for refining MassROUTES addresses the limitation in air pollution data, which is currently drawn from 22 fixed location monitoring stations across the state. These monitors are robust, they're very accurate, but they're very expensive and they can't pick up on localized exposure. One way to address this is either through mobile or low-cost air monitoring systems like the purple air monitor shown here. Low-cost monitors can connect to a Wi-Fi signal to report pollution levels. This presents an opportunity to fill in some of the gaps of the fixed monitors and would paint a clearer picture of air pollution exposure across Massachusetts. Next. For our second policy recommendation, we were interested in how a tool like MassROUTES could be applied in practice. So basically, now that there is a tool, what can you do with it while still focusing on equity? We looked to California, where a program called Transformative Climate Communities directs funds from the state's greenhouse gas cap and invest initiative directly into communities that are highlighted by CalEnviroScreen, which is the analog tool that MassROUTES is largely based off of and that Nalakshi spoke about earlier. There are two pillars of transformative climate communities that we think are important to include in the design of this proposed program. First, Massachusetts should recognize and uplift the power in communities to make decisions about investments in their own neighborhoods. Community-driven, participatory processes should be used to design, implement, and evaluate the proposed program. The second pillar is maximizing community benefits, meaning that investments go toward projects that not only result in emissions reductions, but that also address local social, economic, environmental, and health challenges recognized by MassROUTES. Next.
For the route going forward, first we would like to share a couple limitations that we identified regarding the overall background behind building the screening tool. One obstacle that nobody saw coming came from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the demographic groups identified as vulnerable to air pollution have been those most severely impacted by COVID-19 for many of the same reasons. It's possible that future versions of the tool will be significantly different as a result of the changing socioeconomic and environmental landscape in Massachusetts and all over the US. Another background we wanted to mention is that the conversations around the definition of environmental justice and what types of clean transportation investment are most suitable in Massachusetts is currently evolving. And the project team is not closely involved, so we might not be the most current on the latest developments and have crafted the tool that best complement TCI. Also, in order to best capture the complexity of the issue, we wanted to investigate as many indicators as we could. Well, because some indicators have limited data availability, we might not have captured all the nuances of the issue. Most importantly, throughout this project, we kept reminding ourselves that 5 of us only represent a limited and mostly academic perspective on this issue. The scope of the project didn't allow us to include interviews with local communities and bring more perspectives into deciding indicators. Therefore, many perspectives and experiences might not have been fully represented in the tool. Next. Given the limitations, we recommend first refine and improve the screening tool. Our tool was built with the expectation that it could be modified over time and applied elsewhere. So for example, future research could develop a dynamic scale on the interactive web interface to show how different weighting schemes change outcomes. That would be particularly helpful since other states might have different concerns and priorities. The second step is building a robust decision-making framework for making clean transportation investments. Our tool is only a starting point for identifying priority areas. Future work should develop a program design and program evaluation process for making investments that will most benefit the identified areas. With that being said, the project team hopes to highlight that making investment decisions require us to think systematically. Pollution, inequity, transportation are all connected that should be addressed with a systematic thinking framework that ensures that decisions made won't negatively impact the other end of the system. So yeah, we're really excited to see how the screening tool could be applied in the future. I'm sure the audiences are as well. So now we're happy to hear your comments and answer any questions.